Marcus Webb was 53 years old when he hit rock bottom. Not the kind of bottom where a man loses his job or his savings, those disasters had already happened 3 years ago. This was different. This was the bottom where a man looks at himself in the mirror and doesn't recognize the face looking back. The weathered skin, the defeated eyes, the jaw that had forgotten how to smile. Marcus had become invisible in his own life. 20 years before that terrible reflection, Marcus Webb was a different man. He owned one of the largest cattle ranches in central Texas, nearly 8,000 acres of prime land that had been in his family for 4 generations. The ranch wasn't just a business, it was his identity. Every sunrise brought him to the fields, every sunset reminded him why he was working so hard. He had employees who respected him, neighbors who envied his success, and a reputation for being tough but fair. His ranch produced some of the finest beef in the state, and his name meant something in that world. But success can be fragile, and pride can be dangerous. Marcus learned both lessons the hard way. The drought came in 2008, the same year the economy crumbled. For 18 months, not a single drop of meaningful rain fell across his land. The grass turned brown, then white, then disappeared entirely. Cattle need water and food, and when both become scarce, a rancher's profit margin evaporates as quickly as rainwater under the Texas sun. Marcus borrowed money to keep his cattle alive, certain that the rain would come before the bills became too heavy. He was wrong. By 2010, he owed banks more money than he could ever repay. The interest kept climbing, and his herd kept shrinking. He sold land, the northern pastures first, then the eastern sections. Piece by piece, the ranch that represented 4 generations of his family's legacy was dismantled. By 2013, Marcus lost everything. The bank took the final 3,000 acres, and the rancher was left with nothing but debt and memories. His wife, Catherine, had stood by him for 30 years. She watched her husband's spirit break along with his finances. She tried to comfort him, tried to remind him that they still had each other, that they could start again. But Marcus had already left emotionally. He couldn't look at her because every glance was a reminder of his failure. Catherine died in 2014, not from any particular illness, but from the exhaustion of loving a man who no longer loved himself. Marcus never forgave himself for not being there for her at the end. He had been too busy drowning. After Catherine's death, Marcus became a shadow. He moved to a small apartment in the town of Riverside, a place he'd only known as a visitor when the ranching business was good. He found work as a maintenance man at the local fairground, the irony of which was not lost on him. The man who once owned the land now swept the grounds where others came to celebrate. He lived alone, drank too much whiskey in the evenings, and had systematized his life to involve as few people as possible. His only regular human interaction was with Frank, the older man who worked the night shift at the grocery store where Marcus bought his meager supplies. Frank had known Marcus in the old days, back when the rancher was someone. Frank never mentioned those times, which both hurt and comforted Marcus. It meant Frank wasn't constantly reminding him of what he'd lost, but it also meant that Marcus's fall from grace was so complete that even his presence here was unremarkable. 3 years of this hollow existence had worn Marcus down to his core. He was 53, but he looked 70. His hands, once strong from working the land, were now just old and weathered. He had no family left, no siblings, no children, both his parents had passed years ago. There was no one to call, nowhere to go that made him feel like he belonged. The world had moved on without him, and he was content to let it. On the evening of October 15th, Marcus was sweeping the fairground near the game booths when he heard the laughter. It was the kind of laughter that belongs to young people, the kind that comes from hope and possibility. A group of teenagers was gathered around the bottle knock game, a simple carnival attraction where players pay $5 for 3 balls and try to knock down a pyramid of glass bottles. The teenagers were laughing because they couldn't hit a single bottle. They were throwing the balls all around the bottles, missing by feet in some cases. But they didn't care. They were having fun. The man running the booth was enjoying their failure. He had an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of someone who knew the odds were rigged in his favor. Most carnival games are. They're designed to be nearly impossible, which is why the prizes are so cheap and the take is so reliable. This man probably took in $300 a day, $2,100 a week, thousands of dollars from people chasing the false promise that they could beat the odds. Marcus was about to move on, to get back to his sweeping, when he heard something that made him stop. "Man, nobody can beat this game," one of the teenagers said. "It's impossible." The booth operator laughed. "Not impossible. Just unlikely. Been running this booth for 5 years, and I've seen maybe 2 people actually knock down all 9 bottles in a row with 3 balls. One was an old farmer who swore he was a marksman. The other was a drunk guy who threw all 3 balls at once and somehow connected. Both won the giant panda." He gestured to the enormous stuffed animals hanging from the top of the booth. Marcus felt something stir in him. An old memory. A specific memory. When he was a boy, probably 7 or 8 years old, his grandfather had taken him to the state fair. His grandfather had been a hard man, not unkind but demanding. He wanted to teach Marcus about life's realities, which meant he mostly taught him about loss. They'd walked past the game booths, and his grandfather had explained in detail how they were all rigged, how people were fools to waste their money. But, then, they'd come to the bottle knot game, and the operator had challenged them. He'd said, "Your grandson looks like he might have a good arm. Tell you what, $5 for 3 balls. You knock down all 9, you win the prize." Marcus's grandfather had almost walked away. It was a sucker's bet, he'd said. But Marcus had looked at those bottles, and something inside him had just known, that he could do it. He'd taken the balls, one in each hand and one tucked under his arm. The fairground had seemed to go quiet. He'd thrown the first ball, and it had hit perfectly, knocking over 3 bottles. The second ball had gotten 2 more. The third ball had knocked the remaining 4 bottles down in a beautiful domino effect. He'd won a small dog, nothing fancy, but he'd won. More importantly, his grandfather had looked at him with something that might have been pride. Marcus had carried that moment his entire life, that feeling of being able to do the impossible, of beating the odds. He hadn't thought about that memory in decades. He'd buried it under failure and disappointment and loss. But, standing there in the fairground with his broom in hand, watching the teenagers laugh at their own failures, it came flooding back. Marcus set down his broom. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. There was a $40 bill in there, money he'd been saving for a bottle of his usual whiskey. He looked at the game booth, at the operator who was already looking past the teenagers toward the next potential customer. Marcus walked directly to the booth. $5 for 3 balls, the operator said, already holding them out. All 9 bottles, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. The operator looked at him for the first time. He saw an old man in maintenance clothes, weathered and tired, with no hope in his eyes. He smiled. "That's the game, buddy. $5. You know the rules?" Marcus nodded. He didn't, not exactly, but he could see the bottles. 9 of them arranged in a pyramid. They looked the same as they'd been 45 years ago. He paid his $5 and took the 3 baseballs. His hands shook as he held the first ball. When had they started shaking? He didn't remember that happening. He lined up his shot, thinking about the physics of it, about leverage and angle and follow-through. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his ear. "You know how to do this. You've done it before." Marcus threw the first ball. It flew fast and true, hitting the front left bottle with perfect precision. The bottle exploded, and 2 others fell from the impact. The crowd of teenagers had stopped laughing. They were watching. Marcus picked up the second ball. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was stupid. This was a waste of money. This was exactly the kind of decision that had led to his downfall. His rational mind was screaming all the reasons not to do this, all the reasons to walk away. He threw the second ball anyway. It crashed into the center of the pyramid, causing a cascade of bottles to fall. But not all of them. Two bottles remained standing, wobbling slightly but upright. Impossible shots. The operator's smile had faded slightly. Marcus's hands were definitely shaking now. He picked up the final ball. 3 thrown, 3 possible hits remaining. He needed to knock down both of those last bottles with one ball. Or at least one of them, and have the domino effect finish the job. He thought about Catherine. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the man he used to be. He threw the third ball. It left his hand in slow motion, or so it seemed. He watched it arc through the air, watched it travel toward the bottles. It struck the first remaining bottle at the perfect angle, and that bottle fell into the second bottle, and the second bottle fell. All 9 bottles were down. The fairground went silent. The teenagers started screaming. The booth operator stared at the fallen bottles with an expression of pure disbelief. Marcus had won. His legs felt weak. He'd been holding his breath, and now he released it, and the world seemed to spin slightly. The operator looked at him, and, for the first time, Marcus saw actual respect in the man's eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," the operator said. He reached up and grabbed the largest stuffed animal from the display, a giant panda with oversized black eyes and a dopey expression. He handed it to Marcus. Marcus stood there holding this absurd prize, this enormous plush toy that had no purpose and no value. But he was holding it, and it was real, and he had done the impossible. As he walked away from the booth, the teenagers congratulating him, Marcus felt something crack inside him. Not a bad crack, the kind of crack where light starts to come through. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he might still exist. Like maybe, just maybe, there was still something in him worth saving. He had no idea then what would come next. He had no idea that this moment, this stupid carnival game, would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. He thought he was just a man who'd gotten lucky, who'd beaten a rigged game by accident or fate or the memory of a better time. He was wrong. This night wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a completely new one, and it was going to be more incredible and more dangerous than anything he'd ever imagined. The giant panda went home with Marcus that night, and he set it on the only chair in his small apartment, a worn recliner that had been his constant companion during his darkest evenings. He sat on the edge of the bed, facing the stuffed animal, and, for the first time in years, he laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not the sarcastic kind that came from too much whiskey. A real laugh. It felt strange in his chest, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. His mind kept replaying the moment the last bottle fell, that moment when the impossible became real. He kept thinking about how close he'd come to not even trying, how he'd almost walked past that booth without stopping. What was it that made him stop? Was it the teenager's words? The memory of his grandfather? Divine intervention? Marcus wasn't a religious man, but he was starting to wonder if maybe something had guided him to that spot at that particular moment. By morning, Marcus felt different. The weight on his chest hadn't disappeared entirely, but it felt slightly lighter. He made coffee, something he rarely did, and sat at his small kitchen table with the cup warming his hands. Through the window, he could see the fairground beginning to come alive for the new day. People were already arriving, maintenance workers, booth operators, the owner of the fairground checking things. Marcus knew he had to get to work. It was a Saturday, which meant the fairground would be busy. He arrived at his usual time, 6 in the morning, and began his sweeping routine. The fairground owner, a man named Gerald Hutchins, was already there surveying the grounds. Gerald was in his 60s, a large man with a barrel chest and a voice that carried across the entire fairground. He owned the rides, the booths, everything. He was a successful man in the world of carnival operations, which wasn't saying much compared to legitimate business, but it was something. Gerald stopped Marcus near the entrance. "You coming tonight?" he asked. Marcus looked at him, confused. "Tonight, sir?" "The benefit game. Charity poker tournament. I thought you knew." "Hell, Frank at the store was supposed to tell everyone." Gerald studied Marcus more closely. You look different today. Did something happen? Marcus almost mentioned the bottle game, but something made him stay quiet. No, sir. Just slept a little better. That's good. That's good. Gerald pulled out a cigarette and lit it without offering one to Marcus. Listen, I need to talk to you about something. You've been working here about 3 years now, right? Yes, sir. You're a good worker. Reliable. Honest. I appreciate that. But this job, it's not going anywhere, you understand? And you're not getting any younger. I'm not saying that to be cruel, just being honest. Gerald took a drag. I got a friend, runs a ranch about 200 miles north of here, near Abilene. He needs someone who knows cattle work. The pay would be decent, the work would be hard, but you'd be out in the country again, which I figure is where a man like you belongs. You interested? Marcus felt something shift. A ranch. Real work. Something that meant something. But he was also afraid. What if he wasn't good at it anymore? What if he'd changed too much? I'll think about it, he said. Don't think too long. He's coming down here next week. Gerald walked away, leaving Marcus standing with his broom. The day moved slowly, and, by evening, Marcus found himself at the community center where the benefit poker tournament was being held. He didn't know why he went. He didn't play cards, and poker especially seemed like a fool's game to him. But something pulled him there, the same something that had pulled him to the bottle game. The tournament was in full swing when he arrived. About 50 people were playing at 10 different tables, each one set up in a different corner of the large space. The stakes varied as some tables were friendly games with small bets, some tables had much larger money involved. Marcus wandered through, watching people lose their money to better players, watching the tension on people's faces when they realized they'd made a mistake. Then, he saw the man. He was sitting at the table in the far corner, and there was something about him that made Marcus stop walking. The man was tall, maybe 6'2", with silver hair and expensive clothes. He wore a diamond ring and a gold watch, and he played his cards like he was born to it. He won every hand. Not every single hand, that would have been impossible, but most of them. When he won, he would smile, a smile that didn't carry any joy in it, just the recognition of superiority. When another player won against him, he would nod slightly, like he was acknowledging a temporary anomaly that would soon be corrected. Marcus recognized the man instantly. It was David Chen, and he was someone Marcus had known years ago, back when the ranch was thriving. Chen had been a banker then, one of the men who had loaned Marcus money in the early days of the drought. When Marcus's situation deteriorated, Chen had pushed for the bankruptcy, had made sure the bank recovered every penny it could from the liquidation of the ranch. Chen had made a profit from Marcus's ruin. Marcus turned to leave, but Chen's voice cut across the room. Marcus Webb? Is that you? There was no escaping now. Marcus turned back to face the man who had been one of the architects of his downfall. Chen stood up from his table, and several people around him also stood, like he was someone important enough to warrant that response. He was doing well, clearly. Very well. Mr. Chen, Marcus said, stopping in front of the table. I didn't expect to see you here. Small-town charity poker tournament? No, I wouldn't normally be here. Chen smiled that empty smile. But, an old friend needed a favor, and I come to the area maybe once every few years anyway. Thought I'd stop by, try to support a cause. He gestured to the chair across from him. Join me for a hand? Marcus wanted to refuse. Everything in him wanted to walk away from this man and this moment and everything it represented. But, the same force that had pushed him toward the bottle game pushed him now. He sat down. Chen explained the game Texas Hold'em, $200 entry fee, $500 minimum buy-in. It was serious money for the people in this town, the kind of money that represented weeks of work for most people. For Chen, it was pocket change. Marcus had $43 in his wallet. Don't have enough? Chen asked, noticing his hesitation. Not for this game, Marcus said, and he stood to leave. Wait. Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out a money clip. He removed $500 bills and set them on the table. Consider it a loan. A gesture of good faith between two old acquaintances. You can pay me back whenever. It was a trap, and Marcus knew it. This was exactly the kind of thing that had gotten him into trouble before, the kind of thing his grandfather had warned him against, the kind of thing a smarter man would refuse. But Marcus was tired of being smart. Being smart had left him alone and broken. He took the money. The next 4 hours were a blur of cards and decisions. Marcus, surprisingly, was good at poker. Not because he was a natural, he wasn't, but because he'd learned to read people. Years of dealing with ranching issues, managing difficult employees, negotiating with bankers, had taught him to watch what people did, not just listen to what they said. He could see when someone was bluffing, when someone was confident, when someone was scared. Chen was a good player, but he was used to winning, and that made him predictable. By the end of the tournament, Marcus had turned $500 into $1,800. He'd won against Chen 3 times, and each time, Chen's empty smile had faded just slightly. Now, looking at Marcus, Chen saw something he hadn't expected to see: competence. Capability. You're better at this than I would have expected, Chen said, as people started cashing out their chips around them. I got lucky, Marcus said, which was partly true. No. I don't think so. Chen stood and put on his jacket. He pulled out a business card and set it in front of Marcus. I'm in real estate development now, besides my banking interests. I'm working on a major project about 90 miles south of here, buying up land, rezoning it, selling it for commercial development. It's a significant venture. I'm making a lot of money from it, but I need something. He paused. I need an associate. Someone who knows the land, who knows ranches and farming, who can help identify properties that would work for the project. Someone I can trust. Marcus looked at the card. David Chen, Senior Partner, CC Development Enterprises. Why would you offer me anything? Marcus asked. You took my ranch. You made money from my failure. Chen sat back down. Because I didn't hate you, Marcus. It was business. You lost. I won. That's how the world works. But I've always thought you had potential. You're smart, you're capable, and you clearly still have fight in you. He gestured around the room. Most of the people here gave up a long time ago. You haven't. That's worth something to me. What kind of money? Marcus asked. Good money. You'd manage properties, identify opportunities, handle the on-the-ground operations. I'd handle the business side, the deals, the money. I'd pay you a salary of $5,000 a month, plus a percentage of every successful land acquisition you bring to me. With your knowledge and my capital, we could make a lot of money. $5,000 a month. That was more than Marcus made in 4 months of his current job. With that kind of money, he could get a decent apartment, maybe buy a truck, maybe stop feeling like a ghost in his own life. Why should I trust you? Marcus asked. You shouldn't, Chen said, and there was something almost honest in his tone. You shouldn't trust anyone in my position. But, think about it. You have nothing now. I'm offering you a way to build something again. You can take it or leave it. But, I think you should take it. Marcus looked at the card, at Chen's confident face, at the money sitting in front of him from the poker game. He thought about the giant panda waiting in his apartment, the symbol of his temporary luck. He thought about his grandfather, about Catherine, about all the failures that had brought him to this moment. I need to think about it, Marcus said. You have 1 week, Chen said. He stood and extended his hand. Call my office by Friday, or the offer is gone. I move on to the next person. Marcus shook his hand and left the tournament with $1,800 and a decision looming in front of him like a gathering storm. He didn't know then that this moment, the moment he chose to trust David Chen, would lead him down a path that would make his previous losses look trivial. He didn't know that the things Chen wasn't telling him would eventually become clear, and that clarity would come at a terrible cost. He just knew that he was tired of being invisible, tired of being broken, tired of pretending that survival was the same as living. And if that meant taking a dangerous bet, if that meant trusting someone he shouldn't trust, then maybe that was a price he was willing to pay. Marcus accepted David Chen's offer on Friday, exactly as Chen had predicted he would. Within 2 weeks, he had quit his job at the fairground and moved into a small hotel that Chen paid for while he looked for permanent housing. The salary was real. The first check came through, and Marcus stared at the numbers on the deposit slip for nearly an hour. $3,500 after taxes. In 1 month, he would have more money than he'd had in the previous entire year. Over the next 6 months, Marcus worked harder than he had in years. He spent his days driving across central Texas, looking at land, evaluating properties, understanding the economics of what Chen's development company was trying to do. Chen wanted land that was cheap and could be developed into commercial properties, shopping centers, office parks, industrial zones. Marcus's job was to identify which pieces of farmland and ranches were struggling, who might be willing to sell, and what the potential was for development. It was strange work, because Marcus was essentially helping to do to other people what had been done to him. He was identifying distressed owners, people in financial trouble, people whose properties could be seized and repurposed. But, he told himself it was just business. That was what Chen had said. You win, you lose, that's how the world works. And then, there was Jennifer. She was the manager of a small commercial property that Chen's company had just acquired, a strip mall on the edge of a town called Millbrook. Marcus had been sent to evaluate the property for potential improvements, to see if it could be reconfigured for higher value tenants. Jennifer was in her late 40s, with auburn hair and intelligent eyes, and she'd been managing that property for nearly 15 years. When Marcus walked in, Jennifer was working the front desk herself because the regular receptionist had called in sick. She looked exhausted, but she smiled anyway. "Can I help you?" she asked. "David Chen sent me. I'm evaluating the property for his company." Jennifer's face changed. The smile didn't disappear, but it retreated inward, like a turtle going into its shell. "Of course. Let me show you around." As she walked him through the property, pointing out the maintenance issues and the tenant problems and the structural challenges, Marcus started to understand her situation. She'd been with the previous owner for years, building something, and now that had just been bought out by a development company. Her job security was gone. The property would probably be sold to developers, and she'd be let go when her contract was up in 3 months. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked. "Since 1998, Jennifer said. Long enough to see this mall go from a thriving center to struggling. The big box stores changed everything. People don't shop at strip malls anymore. They go to the big developments north of the town. We've lost 20% of our tenants in the last 5 years. Mr. Chen is probably going to want to sell it for redevelopment," Marcus said, and immediately regretted his honesty. Jennifer nodded. "I know. I've been through this before. A company like Mr. Chen's comes in, identifies the land value, and doesn't care about anything else. It's fine. I'm old enough to have savings. I'll figure it out." But her voice said something different from her words. Marcus went back to Chen with his evaluation. The property was worth more demolished than maintained. There was residential potential in the location. Chen should buy out the remaining tenant contracts, demolish the current structure, and develop a small apartment complex. It would be profitable. Chen was pleased. He approved the plan, and Marcus, as the property liaison, was sent back to implement it. That meant giving Jennifer and the remaining tenants their 60-day notices to vacate. But something happened when Marcus sat across from Jennifer in her small office and handed her the notice. Something broke inside him. He looked at her tired face, at the picture of her and a younger man, probably her son, he thought, on her desk. He thought about Catherine, about how his wife had stood by him while he lost everything. He thought about all the other Jennifers out there, ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives, and then, someone like David Chen came along and took it away. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Jennifer took the notice and read it carefully. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but she wasn't crying. "It's not your fault," she said. "You're just the messenger." But she was wrong. It was his fault. He was making the same choices he was making all along, working for a man who was building wealth on other people's losses. He was becoming the kind of person who could take away someone's livelihood with a polite letter and a handshake. That night, Marcus did something he hadn't done in months. He got drunk. Real drunk, the kind of drunk where the room spins and your thoughts become loud and disorganized. He drank at a bar in Millbrook, alone, thinking about the direction his life had taken. The bottle game had seemed like a turning point, but it wasn't. He'd just jumped from one form of desperation to another. At least when he was sweeping the fairground, he could tell himself that he wasn't hurting anyone. Now he was actively helping to destroy lives. The drunk drive back to the hotel nearly killed him. He hit a curve too fast, and the truck nearly went off an embankment. He managed to bring it back under control, and he sat there in the truck, shaking, staring at the darkness. That was when he made a decision. The next morning, with a hangover that felt like punishment, Marcus called Jennifer. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Not as an employee of Chen's company. Just as a person." They met at a coffee shop an hour later. Marcus looked at her and saw clearly what David Chen was, a man who took from everyone, including Marcus. A man who had convinced Marcus that being complicit in his schemes was acceptable. "Mr. Chen is planning to buy out your tenant contracts for about 20% above their remaining lease value," Marcus said. "The total will be around $240,000. He's going to demolish this building and develop apartments in its place. He'll make about $4 million from this project. And you'll have nothing." Jennifer stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been where you are. I lost everything. And I know what it does to a person." Marcus pulled out a folder. In it was detailed information about the property, the actual profit projections, the timeline, everything. Information that David Chen had shown Marcus in confidence, assuming he was on the team. "I know a real estate lawyer in Austin. Her name is Patricia Moorhead. I want you to contact her. Show her this information. Tell her I sent you." "Why would you do this?" Jennifer asked. "Doesn't this violate your employment agreement or something?" "Probably. Yes. Definitely." Marcus smiled, and it felt like a real smile, not the hollow expression that had become his default. "I just won a bottle game about 6 months ago. Probably the most important moment of my life up to that point. But I didn't realize what I'd really won. I thought I'd won a second chance. But what I really won was the opportunity to make the same mistakes again, in a bigger way, with more money and more consequences. So now I'm making a different choice." Within a week, Patricia Moorhead filed an injunction against Chen's development company, claiming fraudulent land appraisal and suggesting that the property was undervalued in a potential scheme to manipulate tenant contracts. The injunction was just the beginning. Moorhead started pulling at threads, and those threads led to a broader investigation. It turned out that David Chen had been running a systematic scheme across central Texas. He identified distressed properties, used local associates like Marcus to gather information, then used various legal tactics to force out tenants and purchase land at artificially low prices. He had done this with dozens of properties over 10 years. The land value difference between what he paid and what the properties were actually worth added up to something like $70 million. Federal investigators got involved. The SEC started asking questions. Banks started reviewing Chen's transactions. And, within 3 months, David Chen was arrested for fraud, wire fraud, and a variety of other charges. And Marcus was subpoenaed to testify against him. The trial lasted 2 months. Marcus sat in a witness box and told the truth about what Chen had done, about the scheme, about how he'd used local knowledge to identify vulnerable properties and vulnerable people. Chen sat at the defense table with an expression of pure disbelief, like he couldn't fathom that someone from his own team would betray him. When Marcus finished his testimony, Chen looked at him with the kind of hatred that suggested that, if looks could kill, Marcus would have dropped dead on the witness stand. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had finally made a choice that he could live with. Chen was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The assets he'd accumulated through fraud were seized. And, because Marcus had been instrumental in the prosecution, the law firm handling the case worked with him to recover some of the money that had been obtained fraudulently. Patricia Moorhead helped Marcus establish a claim against Chen's seized assets. As someone who had been directly harmed by Chen's schemes, because yes, Marcus had been just as much a victim as Jennifer, even if he'd been complicit in his victimization, Marcus received a settlement of $250,000. The money came through on a Tuesday in March, 2 years and 5 months after he'd won the bottle game at the fairground. Marcus held the bank transfer confirmation in his hand and cried, actual tears, for the first time since Catherine had died. Not tears of sadness or desperation, but tears of something like grace. A second chance that he'd actually earned this time. He used the money carefully. He bought a small house, nothing fancy, but something with real walls and a yard. He hired a lawyer and worked with the county to establish a fund for people whose properties had been damaged by Chen's schemes. He spent several months volunteering with a nonprofit that helped people recover from financial disasters. He became, in his way, a voice for people like himself and Jennifer and countless others who had been victimized by predatory business practices. And he kept the giant panda. It sat in the corner of his living room, a reminder of the night he'd knocked down the bottles and changed his life, and the series of choices that came after. Jennifer survived too. With the information Marcus had given her, and, with Patricia Moorhead's help, she'd secured a settlement that gave her enough money to retire early. She opened a coffee shop in Millbrook, something she'd always wanted to do. The coffee shop became a gathering place for people in the town, a reminder that someone like Jennifer could take a loss and build something better from it. One afternoon, about 3 years after the trial ended, Marcus was working in his yard when Frank from the grocery store, the old friend who'd been the only person Marcus had seen during his dark years, drove up. Frank was carrying something in his truck, something large and covered with a tarp. "What's this?" Marcus asked. Frank pulled back the tarp to reveal an old ranch sign, badly weathered but still readable. It said Webb Family Ranch, EST 1954. "I found this at an auction of salvaged property," Frank said. "Nobody knew what it was worth, and I got it cheap. I figured you might like to have it." Marcus held the sign in his hands, feeling the weight of it, understanding exactly what Frank was trying to tell him. That the past wasn't something to be forgotten, but something to be honored. That losing a ranch didn't mean losing the right to be called a rancher. He mounted the sign above his front door, and it stayed there for the rest of his life. Years later, when people would ask Marcus about his story, about how he'd gone from nothing to something, he would point to 2 things. The first was the giant panda in the living room, the symbol of his moment of belief when everything seemed impossible. The second was the ranch sign above the door, the reminder that no matter what you lose, it doesn't define you. It's what you choose to do after the loss that matters. The bottle game wasn't the moment that changed everything. The choice to speak up, to betray Chen, to stand with Jennifer instead of against her, that was the moment. That was when Marcus Webb truly won something worth keeping. He won the knowledge that even after you've failed, even after you've lost everything, even after you've made the same mistakes again in a bigger way, there is still a chance to do the right thing. And, sometimes, that chance is all you need.